Welcome and a warm greeting to you as we approach session 4 of the history of anti-Semitism. In the last 3 episodes or programs, we've tried to give a very reduced history of this hatred without cause, this dreadful spirit that has dominated history from its earliest days, that has marginalised, separated, persecuted and murdered Jewish people since the dawn of time. So let's just quickly recap. From our last session, we saw the first real exterminatory utterances towards the Jewish people in the Common Era, shall we say, because remember that Haman wanted to kill all the Jews, as we saw in the book of Esther in our first program. But Martin Luther, as we saw, was the first person to say, we are at fault for not slaying them. So let's remember as well that anti-Semitism progresses in the following manner. You have no right to live amongst us and be different. You have no right to live amongst us. You have no right to live. So anti-Semitism basically has 3 forms. Vulgar anti-Semitism, both religious and secular, and we've seen that illustrated as we've been going along. Then, as we come into the period that we're looking at today, we're moving on to what I call sophisticated anti-Semitism, which is where the intelligentsia start to make their pronouncements and proclamations. This really starts following Martin Luther as we move into what is generally known as the Enlightenment, or as some Jewish friends of mine call it, the Endarkenment. But this was a period of great intellectual movement and great intellectual progress. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism now began to take on a more respectable face, and it just wasn't viewed at this time as just being a religious thing. It moved on to be intellectually qualified. And I think in the UK and in America as well, we've seen how the intelligentsia has really picked up on anti-Semitic models, very often using the Palestinian situation, or the Palestinian myth as I prefer to call it, as a tool and a weapon against the Jewish people. And let's remember, there was no Israel until 1948, but from that moment onwards, we got not just anti-Semitism - anti-Judaism, but we also got a real anti-Israel as a state movement as well. Israel is the state of the Jewish people, therefore viz. Anti-Semitism, anti-Israelism, anti-Judaism, they're all facets of the same phenomena. Then, of course, once the intellectuals got hold of it during the Enlightenment, and as time moved on, then we moved on to exterminatory anti-Semitism. So what I like to do in the first section, in the next few minutes, the first portion, if you like, of this teaching, is I'd like to split this into 2 parts. I'd like to look at anti-Semitism in, loosely speaking, what today is commonly referred to as Russia. But of course, as we explained earlier, modern geography and geography in years gone by are really quite different. So what we're going to look at is we're going to look at anti-Semitism in what today we would call Poland, Russia, Ukraine in particular, and today Moldova will be part of that as well. So we're going to look at Russian anti-Semitism, using that as a catch-all phrase, up until the outbreak of World War II and the Holocaust, where this series will finish, for reasons I'll mention as we close. Secondly, we're going to look at anti-Semitism in Europe, and then as we move on into the States and elsewhere as appropriate. And we'll find in the second half is where we really move on to things that are probably more readily understandable and more common in the days that we live in. So let's pick up where we more or less where we left in the Reformation, Martin Luther. And as we said, Martin Luther felt that all Jews should be killed or displaced. His legacy was that the Elector of Saxony expelled all the Jews shortly following his death. But in the papal world, in 1569, Pope Pius V expelled all the Jews from Rome, surrounding areas, and other papal properties. This was followed shortly later, well, 30 years later or so, in 1593, when Pope Clement VIII took further actions against the Jewish people, expelling them from the papal states, Rome, and various other locations of influence. So we're going to move into Russia now, Ukraine. At the time, we're going to start speaking about what we know as Russia today was pretty much all of Russia as we understand it, the Baltics, what today we call Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, and all these countries were part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. That might be a bit of an unfamiliar identity. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. There were basically three classes of people that lived in these areas. But firstly, how did they get there? Well, there's always been a Jewish presence in the southern part of Russia and certainly in the Ukraine, and the Radhanite traders can be traced back to 700 years before the Common Era, trading along the shores of the Black Sea. When Kiev, or Kievan Rus, as it was known, became recognised as a country within its own right, round about late 9th century, possibly, round about there was an established Jewish presence. And Jewish presence permeated seacoasts and cities where trade took place. The big influx of Jewish people into these lands really followed the expulsions from Europe. And firstly, affected the Crusades, moving up from Germany and so on. And there were a number of crusades that went on, not just the first and second one, really up to the period that we took into the 13th century, certainly. And that promoted a movement, but also the expulsion from Spain in 1492 and Portugal, more and more people pushing up, and various expulsions, as we said, from Rome, various other places. There was a northward drift, and the Jewish population became very large. In addition, in Poland, by the invitation of one of the kings, because they needed administrators and businessmen as well, for lack of a better expression, and estate managers, Jewish people were actually invited to go to Poland, which ironically, by the time we get to the 19th and 20th centuries, of course, as the distasteful distinction of being one of the most anti-Semitic countries in the world and in modern history. So let's go into the 16th century, 17th century, and then we can see here large Jewish populations spread through the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The population basically was like this: four strata. The Poles with the aristocracy, the landowners, and wielded power. The German merchant class were the second class, and they controlled most of the trade in these areas, and particularly in the Ukraine, where we're going to focus on in a moment. The Ukrainians themselves were the peasant class, the labourers, and the ones that did all the donkey work, if you like, real peasants. And under these sort of rules, the peasants actually were more like serfs. They really sort of belonged to the landowners rather than being free men, who was somewhere curious thing, sort of in the middle, if you like. Now, a really dreadful occurrence took place in the Ukraine, and it was the first big massacre outside the Crusades of the Jewish people. And an event took place between 1648 and 1654. that was initiated by the hetman, that's headman, the hetman, it's a word that sounds very familiar, the hetman of the Zaporizhian Cossacks, whose name was Bogdan Khmelnytsky. Khmelnytsky was away campaigning when Polish overlord took his potential wife, more or less kidnapped her and forced her to marry him and so on. Khmelnytsky, in a fit of rage, got the whole horde, the called hordes, Cossack gatherings, the Zaporizhian ones, along with the Dnieper Cossacks, and they attacked the Jewish people. Now, the managers of Jewish estates, so the managers of Polish estates, fish ponds, toll collectors, and most of the administration in the Ukraine at this time were run by Jewish people, and as Jewish people were regarded as being servants of the Poles or in league with them, they set out on a campaign of destruction. And it really was enough to make your hair stand on end. They marauded right through the Ukraine, and if you should read the book A to Z of Aliyah, there is a list in there of all the communities that were destroyed by Khmelnytsky. And it covers 2 pages, plus dozens and dozens, and some aren't even in that list. They're just the ones I was able to collect. However, it should be said that the figure of deaths is a bit debatable. We can say comfortably there's over 50,000 killed, but better figures are probably reaching or exceeding 100,000 people. Now, the Jewish people weren't just simply slaughtered. Many were tortured to death. A favourite method was to put them in lines and run carts with iron wheels over them and crush them to death. Women, needless to say, were always raped. Pregnant women had the children torn from inside them, the bodies. Live animals such as rats and mice were put into slashed stomachs and roughly sutured, and various other forms of torture. The Jewish population was almost destroyed in the Ukraine by Bogdan Khmelnytsky. Today, Bogdan Khmelnytsky is a national hero in the Ukraine. His picture appears on the 5 hryvnia note. There's an equestrian statue of him in St. Sophie's Square in Kiev. There's a big marble bust of him in Odessa, and there's even a town called Khmelnytsky. So this is the first major slaughter of the Jewish people since the Crusades. So following on from this, life of the Jewish people really was very uncomfortable, and right across what we're going to call Russia, because something really quite remarkable happened. The Polish-Lithuanian Empire more or less collapsed during this time, and this is when the Romanovs and the dynasty of the Tsars begins to take place. In 1654, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, much to the surprise of his contemporaries, signed a treaty at Pereslav in 1654 that, to use a German expression, brought about an Anschluss with Russia, and Ukraine from then on became part of Russia. So things went fairly badly for the Jewish people, and in 1854 the Pale of Settlement was enacted that enclosed Jewish people within certain lands that reached down from the Baltics into the Ukraine, but was mentally, if you like, sectioned with various points of access, and Jewish people were contained in this Pale of Settlement. And there were various disabilities included in that they weren't allowed to leave without permission, weren't allowed to attend various institutions, and various other disabilities were put upon them. One of them being that they couldn't live in various towns or cities, and this is where the shtetl sort of arises, like Fiddler on the Roof, places like that, where there are Jewish settlements outside of towns and cities. Jewish people were always very unpopular amongst non-Jewish people because because of disabilities. They were generally moneylenders, pawnbrokers, and tavern keepers. Those that didn't work in menial tasks. In 1889, following the assassination of Alexander III, there were massive pogroms against the Jewish people. As usual, the Jewish people were accused of wanting to take over, plotting, and being dangerous. So the following pogrom, in 1889, there were 160 pogroms against Jewish people, resulting in the death of 50,000 people. So we'll pick up again. We're going to take a short break to go to Ezra, and then we'll pick up from where that went, and then we'll go and look what was happening outside of Russia.
Ezra International is a Christian nonprofit organization that helps Jewish people immigrate to Israel, or as they say in Israel, make Aliyah. Through your generous support, we are able to help Jewish people make Aliyah by providing one-on-one support for Jewish people in their home countries, completing in-depth ancestry research, by procuring necessary immigration documents, and finally, financing the immigration journey. Since 1995, Ezra International supporters have helped tens of thousands of people from around the world, and thousands are still waiting to return to Israel. God said he would be known by both the Jewish people and the nations when he restores them to their land. Your financial gift helps make that happen. Give now and be part of this great prophetic restoration process. Go to ezrainternational.org and give your gift of hope today.
Welcome back. So following these pogroms, they were followed fairly quickly by the May Laws. The May Laws increased the pressures on those living in the Pale of Settlements, and they weren't allowed to attend universities outside of there, attend schools there, trade outside of there without permission, and it really enclosed them even more. There were further programs, again, hundreds, thousands of deaths, even while this was being enacted. In 1903, there was the infamous Kishinev program that was the result of a blood libel. 24 gangs attacked the Jewish population that was over 100,000, 50 direct deaths, 90 people mutilated, 500 wounded, 700 dwellings destroyed, and 10,000 people being made homeless. This was the times that the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, a notorious anti-Semitic book, was published. Basically, it says that the elders of the Jewish communities met together at midnight in a graveyard in Prague, and they raised the devil who gave them instructions in how to take over the world. Sounds ridiculous. It was shown to be a forgery in 1922 by the Times in London, but that sold hundreds of thousands of copies and is probably one of the most dominant anti-Semitic writings that was widely circulated, and it still exists. In Poland in the 80s and 90s, when we were over there, it was freely available in Catholic churches. It was normally given as a gift to visitors to Kuwait right through into 2000 and something, to the best of my knowledge. 1913, there was another blood libel, and this was the infamous trial of Menachem Mendel Baylis, who was accused of murdering a 13-year-old boy in the caves outside of Kiev in order to mix his blood in the matzot to make matzot, Jewish blood, Christian blood, taken by Jews to make matzot for Passover. It was a big trial, all kinds of political unrest, many actions against Jewish people. In the end, it was decided that it really wasn't the case. Round about this time again, and we might push it back a little bit further, right back to 1889, there was a political movement named the Black Hundreds, who were super nationalists, the Black Hundreds, and they persistently rampaged through Jewish communities right up to the time we're speaking about, with a great cry of the Tsar and the nation. So as we can see, the Jewish people had a terrible time, and eventually we come up to Russian Revolution. Simon Pretoria and the Ukrainian Independence Army slaughtered tens of thousands of Jewish people in the Ukraine because it was thought that the Jewish people supported the revolution. And then, of course, from there, as you know, common knowledge to all of our viewers and listeners, and to people who I'm hoping have joined us for the first time, that eventually, following communism, the Soviet Union became the world's largest prison camp for the Jewish people. After the war, 1953, the doctors' trial, where Jewish doctors were accused of trying to murder the Politburo, made things even worse. And as they say, the rest is history. So it's important that we recognise and realise this blood-soaked, dreadful history for the Jewish people in what we're calling, as a catch-all phrase, in Russia. So now let's move to the West. What was happening over there? Well, rather interesting really, because anti-Semitism in Europe, in France, was very virulent, and it was remarked to me at one or two scholars' conferences that, in one sense, the Holocaust might have been more likely to have taken place in France because it was a home of much anti-Semitic writing, and particularly following the French Revolution, because following the French Revolution and when Napoleon took over, the Jews were given equal rights. And this was very, very resented. And this eventually led to, years later, the trial of Alfred Dreyfus, which I'm fairly sure you might know about, where a Jewish senior army officer was accused of giving secrets away. And it turned out it wasn't him at all. It was a purely anti-Semitic thing. But this has been pushed by the anti-Semitic newspaper, La Libre Parole, and it was the author Emile Zola who actually took a big page out in the main French newspaper with the headline "J'accuse," I accuse, and he defended Dreyfus, and it was proved that Count Esterhazy had sold these secrets on, but not before Dreyfus had been publicly humiliated, disgraced, and sent to Devil's Island. But we'll go back to France in a moment. Now, in America, in 1862, General Ulysses S. Grant felt that a lot of the problems were caused by Jewish people, and they fomented many of the problems. So under General Order Number 11, Ulysses S. Grant in 1862 ordered all Jewish people to be expelled from Texas, Tennessee, and Mississippi. And that lasted for quite a long time. Of course, in America, as we know, we've had several dreadful anti-Semitic outbursts. The Ku Klux Klan being a later one. Henry Ford, with his publication, The Dearborn Independent, which was compulsory reading for the SS. Hitler thought it was absolutely wonderful. Henry Ford, with motor fame, The Dearborn Independent, one of America's leading anti-Semites, leading up to the time of World War II. Now, if we sort of push back a little bit, we're going to find out that the mid-19th century, we move on to what is called scientific anti-Semitism, I guess. And it was in the term anti-Semitism actually was coined by the German historian August Ludwig von Schlosser so about the late end of the 18th century. But a lot of writings started to appear in the 19th century, such as the writings of Count Arthur Gobineau, who did a 4-volume essay on the inequality of races. Not that it was necessarily anti-Semitic as we define it in its modern coin, but the movement to the inferiority and superiority of races became a very hot topic, which eventually inevitably led to the eugenic movement. So we find a number of writings, particularly from France. Ernest Renan wrote his Life of Jesus, where he pointed to the dreadful Jewish people and pointing out that they were inferior by and large. But it was Willem Maar who actually founded the League of Anti-Semites, and he saw this again as to improve the human stock. As I say, predecessors of the eugenic movement. During this time was a flurry of measuring skulls, distances between eyes, jawlines, statures, and all these things. And all these things were moving to prove that the Jewish race were physically inferior, which was taken up obviously by Hitler later. So we've got these people, and French philosophers were very against the Jewish people, and Voltaire, one of France's greatest philosophical writers, was absolutely against the Jews and felt that they were a danger, and the usual reasons why Jewish people were largely unwelcome and shouldn't be around or even left alive. So we move on now to Richard Wagner, one of the greatest anti-Semites of all time, and Hitler was a great fan of Wagner. And Wagner has this distinction of introducing neo-paganism into Germany. Wagner wrote a big treatise, Die Judentum, in music, where he said that Jews were non-creative and any music that they'd written would simply been stolen from non-Jewish composers. So Wagner wrote the Ring Cycle, Parsifal, and many other pagan-based operas and pieces of music. And Hitler said when he left the Bayreuth Festival, that was the annual celebration of Wagner's music, he felt as if the ornaments had been taken from the Christmas tree. So the eugenic movement rises, particularly in America, largely due to writings of Darwin and Galton. And the Eugenic Society started off to see how they could improve the human race. And this took place more in America than anywhere, followed hotly by Germany, to the extent that we get Himmler complaining that the Americans are further advanced in eugenics than Nazi Germany. And all these things start the same way, both in America and in Germany. The first thing is where there's a court case where concerned parents ask the children to be taken into care, and so on. And eventually, by the 1930s in America, and certainly in Germany, compulsory sterilizations and various other confinements, and then eventually the first gas chambers where people were considered mentally impaired. So for their own good, it's a bit like putting pets down. It's like euthanizing pets. The eugenic movement turned into a euthanasia movement, and needless to say, the Jews were the top of the list because they were considered to be inferior. So we've moved on. We've tried to cover a lot of ground in a short space of time, but sufficient to say vulgar anti-Semitism moved on to sophisticated anti-Semitism that moved on to exterminatory anti-Semitism. We can see this more in the West than in Russia, although needless to say, various Russian intellectuals were very anti-Semitic anyway. It was almost a default position. So the vulgar anti-Semitism moves into the universities, if you want, then it moves into the administration, and organised and mechanised death become the norm for the Jewish people.